If you ever find a stranger hiding in your cargo bay at 2 in the morning, don't ask who she is. Ask who's chasing her. That was the rule Daniel Carter had learned after 8 years running salvage along the outer trade routes. And tonight the rule was proving itself again. The air in Dock Ring C smelled like overheated wiring and recycled coffee, the kind that left a metallic taste on the back of your tongue. Daniel wiped grease off his hands and slid out from under the engine housing of the old freight shuttle he'd been repairing for the last 12 hours. The station clock on the wall blinked 2:17 a.m., Earth Standard Time, and the only sound was the slow hum of the life support fans pushing stale air through the corridor. That was when he heard it. Not a crash, not an alarm, just a quiet shift of metal from inside the cargo bay behind him. Daniel froze for a second, listening. Salvage work had taught him the difference between a loose crate and a living thing trying very hard not to be noticed. This was definitely the second one. He grabbed the flashlight clipped to his belt and walked toward the bay door, boots echoing softly across the steel floor. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "Either that's a rat the size of a golden retriever, or I've got company." The cargo door slid open with a tired hiss. Inside, the bay was dim, lit only by the blue glow of the station's emergency strips. Stacks of salvage containers cast long shadows across the floor. Daniel stepped inside, sweeping the lights slowly across the room. Nothing moved at first. Just crates, tarps, and the skeletal frame of a drone he'd been meaning to sell for parts. Then the beam of the flashlight landed on a pair of eyes watching him from behind a cargo pallet. Bright, reflective, definitely not human. Daniel blinked once, lowered the light slightly, and sighed the way a mechanic sighs when discovering another broken part in an already broken engine. "You know," he said calmly, "most people knock before sneaking into someone's workspace." The figure behind the crate shifted and slowly stood. She was tall, easily a head taller than him, with skin the color of deep ocean blue that caught the light like polished glass. Silver hair fell over one shoulder in a loose braid, and the fabric of her travel cloak shimmered faintly with embedded circuitry. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Daniel studied her like he would a strange machine. Curious, cautious, but not afraid. Finally, he rubbed the back of his neck and chuckled. "Well," he said, "either I'm more tired than I thought, or I just found an alien hiding in my cargo bay." The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him with calm golden eyes that seemed far too composed for someone sneaking through a salvage station at 2 in the morning. Somewhere in the distance a station radar ping echoed through the hull, followed by the distant rumble of ships entering orbit. Daniel didn't know it yet, but by sunrise every scanner in the sector would be searching for the woman standing in front of him, and the quiet little salvage dock he called home was about to become the center of a story the entire galaxy would hear about. Daniel Carter had learned long ago that the worst moment in any strange situation was the silence right after you realized it was real. The woman standing in his cargo bay did not move, did not panic, and did not look particularly concerned that she had been discovered. That alone told him she was not some desperate stowaway hoping for luck. The hum of the station systems filled the air between them, low and steady, like the sound of a distant highway at night. Daniel slowly lowered the flashlight until it pointed at the floor instead of directly at her face. "All right," he said in a calm voice. "Let us start with the obvious question. Why are you hiding in my cargo bay?" The woman studied him carefully, her golden eyes reflecting the blue station lights. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but precise, each word clear as if she had practiced the language carefully. "Because it was the safest place on this station." Daniel let out a small laugh and leaned against a nearby crate. That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said about Dock Ring C. He looked her up and down again, taking in details the way a mechanic examines unfamiliar equipment. Her cloak was not cheap travel fabric. The thin silver lines woven through it were energy conductors. Her boots were not built for cargo work either. They were polished and perfectly balanced, designed for someone used to walking long corridors rather than climbing through maintenance shafts. Everything about her said wealth, power, or both, which made the situation even stranger. A soft chime echoed through the station speakers. Incoming traffic alert. Multiple vessels entering orbit. Daniel glanced toward the ceiling as if he could see through it into space. "Busy night," he muttered. Then he looked back at her. You want to explain why the safest place on this station suddenly looks like my repair shop? The woman hesitated for the first time. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, but Daniel caught it. She was choosing her words carefully. I required a location that would not be scanned immediately. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That sounds like the kind of sentence people say when scanners are exactly what they are trying to avoid. Outside the cargo bay, a distant vibration rolled through the station structure as larger ships adjusted position in orbit. The woman's eyes shifted briefly toward the ceiling, then back to Daniel. Not fear. Calculation. Daniel noticed the way she stood, perfectly balanced, calm even with the distant rumble of engines echoing through the station hall. Whoever she was, she had not grown up worrying about repair bills or oxygen filters. Look, Daniel said finally, rubbing grease from his fingers with a rag. I do not run security here. I fix broken engines and sell scrap. If someone is chasing you, that is your problem, not mine. The woman studied him for another long moment, and something in her expression softened slightly, as if she had just realized something unexpected. You are not afraid, she said quietly. Daniel shrugged. Lady, I once spent 3 days stuck inside an airlock with a malfunctioning heater and half a sandwich. Compared to that, meeting a mysterious alien at 2 in the morning is not the worst thing that has happened to me. For the first time, a faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. Then the station lights flickered once as another deep vibration passed through the structure above them. Daniel tilted his head toward the ceiling again. Let me guess, he said casually. Those ships up there are not here for engine repairs. The woman's golden eyes held his. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the truth behind it. No, she said softly. They are looking for me. Daniel stared at her for a moment, then let out a slow breath and rubbed his face. Of course they are, he muttered. Why would tonight be normal? Daniel Carter stared at her for a long second after she said it. The ships above the station were here for her. Not for cargo inspections. Not for trade permits. For her. The distant rumble of engines vibrated faintly through the deck plates beneath his boots, a deep mechanical growl that reminded him of thunder rolling across open plains back on Earth. He slowly exhaled and leaned his elbow on the crate beside him. You know, he said, most people lead with that part of the story. The blue-skinned woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward slightly into the pale light of the cargo bay. The glow from the station strips reflected across her skin like moonlight across calm water. Up close, Daniel could see details he had missed before. The fabric of her cloak carried microscopic energy threads that adjusted temperature and pressure automatically. The small emblem at the collar was not decorative either. It was a crest, not a company logo, not a merchant tag. Something older, something official. Daniel rubbed his chin slowly. Let me guess, he said. You are not just running from parking tickets. Her golden eyes watched him carefully. No. Another vibration rolled through the station as the ships outside adjusted position in orbit. The cargo bay walls hummed softly with the change in magnetic balance. Daniel had worked on this station long enough to know what that meant. Large vessels. Military-grade mass. He walked over to the open bay door and glanced down the corridor where dim security lights stretched into the distance. No alarms yet. No patrols. But that would change soon. He returned his attention to her. All right, he said calmly. Let me explain something about stations like this. When a fleet parks above us in the middle of the night, people start asking questions. Security officers start scanning cargo manifests. And eventually someone notices the mechanic with an unexpected guest. The woman stood perfectly still while he spoke, her posture composed in a way that made the entire cargo bay feel smaller. Daniel noticed something else now. She was not nervous. She was thinking, carefully measuring every word and movement around her. Finally, she spoke again. If they locate me here, it will cause complications for you. Daniel laughed softly. Complications? He gestured toward the ceiling where the faint vibration of orbiting ships continued. Lady, I think we passed complications about 3 ships ago. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him from a new angle. You could report me to station security. Daniel wiped his hands on the rag again and tossed it onto a workbench. Sure, I could, but that would mean paperwork. And I hate paperwork. The corner of her mouth twitched again in that faint, almost invisible smile. Daniel noticed it this time. Interesting. Outside the station, another ship engine pulsed, sending a ripple through the metal floor. Daniel walked to a small terminal on the wall and tapped the screen. A basic orbital traffic display flickered to life. 3 ships had arrived. No, 4. Each one far larger than a cargo vessel. His eyebrows lifted slowly. Well, he said under his breath, that is impressive. The woman watched the screen as well, her golden eyes reflecting the faint holographic glow. Daniel leaned back against the console and folded his arms. All right, he said after a moment. Let us skip the mystery part. People do not send that kind of fleet for a random traveler. He looked directly at her. So who exactly are you? The cargo bay remained silent for a long moment except for the hum of machines and the distant presence of ships waiting above the station. When she finally answered, her voice was calm, clear, and completely certain. My name, she said, is Lyra Vale. Daniel blinked once, then twice. Okay, he said slowly. That sounds important. She met his eyes without hesitation. I am the daughter of the High Throne. The mechanic stared at her for a moment before letting out a quiet breath. Of course you are, he said. Because why would tonight be simple? Daniel Carter had expected many strange things during his years on the outer trade routes, but discovering that the woman hiding in his cargo bay was royalty had definitely not been on the list. He stared at Lyra Vale for several seconds while the quiet hum of the station wrapped around them like distant wind through steel walls. Somewhere far above the station, engines from the waiting fleet pulsed again, sending another low vibration through the floor beneath his boots. Daniel finally rubbed his forehead and let out a long breath. You know, he said slowly, most people would have opened with the princess part. Lyra did not react with embarrassment or offense. She simply watched him with that same calm focus that seemed completely out of place in a cargo bay full of spare engine parts and dented salvage crates. I was uncertain how you would respond, she replied. Daniel gave a short laugh and leaned back against the console beside the traffic display. Well, I can tell you one thing for sure. I was not expecting to hear that tonight. He glanced at the orbital monitor again where the icons representing the ships above the station hovered like silent shadows. 4 vessels now held position in the upper atmosphere, each one easily the size of a small city block. Daniel had worked around spacecraft long enough to recognize their design, even from simplified radar shapes. Those were not merchant vessels. They were official fleet ships. He pointed at the display with one finger. Those ships belong to your people. Lyra nodded once. Yes. Daniel folded his arms and tilted his head slightly. Let me guess. They are not here to bring you a welcome home parade. For the first time her expression shifted, not quite a frown, but something more thoughtful. No, she said quietly. Daniel chuckled again, though this time there was a trace of disbelief in it. Of course not. That would make too much sense. The station lights flickered briefly as another energy fluctuation rippled through the power grid. Daniel glanced toward the ceiling again, then back to her. So here is the part one do not understand, he continued. If you are some kind of interstellar princess, why are you hiding inside a mechanic's cargo bay instead of sitting comfortably on one of those ships up there? Lyra remained silent for a moment before answering. Her gaze drifted toward the corridor outside the cargo bay, as if she could see through the walls into the cold vacuum beyond the station hall. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, but no less steady. Because those ships are not here to bring me home. Daniel studied her face carefully. For the first time he noticed something beneath the calm surface of her composure. Not fear. Exactly. More like the quiet tension of someone who had already made a difficult decision long before this moment. Daniel pushed himself away from the console and paced a few steps across the cargo bay floor, boots tapping against the metal plates. The smell of engine oil and cooling circuits filled the air around him. Finally he stopped and looked back at her. All right, he said. Let me see if I understand the situation correctly. He gestured upward toward the invisible fleet above the station. 4 massive ships arrive in orbit in the middle of the night. A mysterious alien princess is hiding inside my cargo bay, and apparently those ships are searching for you. He paused, then shook his head slightly with a tired smile. That means 2 things. First, tonight just became the most interesting shift I have had in years. He met her golden eyes again. And second, if those ships really want to find you, this station is not going to stay quiet for very long. As if the universe had been waiting for him to say it, the station intercom suddenly crackled to life overhead. A calm mechanical voice echoed through the corridor. Attention, all personnel. External fleet authorities have requested full station scan authorization. Daniel slowly looked up at the speaker in the ceiling. Then he looked back at Lyra. Well, he said under his breath. That did not take long. The announcement echoed through the station corridors with the calm indifference of a machine that had no idea how much trouble it had just caused. Daniel Carter stared at the ceiling speaker for a moment while the words settled in his head. External fleet authorities requesting full station scan authorization. He slowly lowered his gaze back toward Lyra. The princess had not moved. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the cargo bay entrance, as if she were already calculating how much time they had left. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and released a quiet sigh. Well, he muttered, there goes my peaceful night. Another pulse from the ships above rolled through the station hull, stronger this time. The vibration rattled a loose wrench on the workbench beside him. Daniel reached over and stopped it from clattering off the table. All right, he said after a moment, thinking out loud the way mechanics often did when solving a complicated engine problem. If they run a full station scan, they will sweep every cargo hold, every maintenance shaft, every ventilation duct. He glanced around the bay as if seeing his own workspace for the first time. Which means this place is about to become very interesting. Lyra finally spoke again. How long before the scan begins? Daniel walked to the wall terminal and tapped the screen until a station status panel appeared. Numbers and system icons flickered across the display. He read through them quickly, his mechanic instincts translating the technical readouts almost automatically. 5 minutes, he said. Maybe less. The princess nodded once, absorbing the information without visible panic. Daniel noticed that again. Most people would be pacing by now or asking a dozen questions at once. Lyra simply stood there with quiet composure, like someone who had been trained her entire life to remain calm when the universe suddenly became complicated. Daniel leaned against the console and studied her for a moment. You know, he said thoughtfully, for someone being hunted by half a fleet, you are handling this remarkably well. Lyra's expression remained composed. Panic rarely improves outcomes. Daniel chuckled softly. That might be the most royal sentence I have ever heard. He pushed himself away from the console and walked slowly across the cargo bay, scanning the stacked crates and equipment with a mechanic's practical eye. Old drone frames, engine housings, spare hull plating. To most people it would look like a junk pile. To Daniel it looked like possibilities. Finally he stopped beside a large crate marked with faded salvage tags. He tapped the metal lid with his knuckles. All right, he said. I have a question for you, princess. Lyra turned her attention toward him. What is it? Daniel crossed his arms. Do your people's scanners detect organic life signs directly, or do they read through environmental heat signatures first? For the first time, Lyra seemed slightly surprised by the question. She considered it briefly before answering. They analyze environmental energy patterns before isolating biological signals. Daniel's eyebrows lifted. Good, he said quietly. That gives us something to work with. He pulled open the crate beside him and began moving aside several compact engine coils stacked inside. The coils glowed faintly with stored energy from their last charge cycle. These old fusion stabilizers leak just enough radiation to confuse half the scanners in this sector, he explained while working. Usually it is a problem. Tonight it might be useful. Lyra stepped closer, watching him carefully. You intend to hide me inside the interference field. Daniel gave a small grin. You are catching on fast. Another announcement crackled faintly through the station speakers somewhere down the corridor as external scan protocols continued to activate. Daniel wiped his hands on his shirt and looked at her again. All right, princess, he said calmly. If we are going to survive the next few minutes, we are going to need to trust each other a little. He gestured toward the crate and the glowing coils inside it. Because once those scanners start sweeping this station, every secret in here is about to be tested. Daniel Carter moved quickly now, the calm rhythm of problem-solving replacing the earlier disbelief. When a mechanic had 5 minutes before a system failure, there was no time for dramatic speeches. You simply fixed what you could and hoped the universe cooperated long enough for the repair to hold. The fusion stabilizer coils inside the crate hummed softly as he repositioned them, their faint blue glow reflecting off the steel walls of the cargo bay. Each unit was about the size of a toolbox and weighed close to 30 pounds. Daniel lifted them with the casual familiarity of someone who had handled heavy machinery for most of his adult life. "All right," he said while sliding the last coil into position. "These things leak just enough background radiation to confuse environmental scanners. Not enough to cause damage, just enough to look messy on a sensor grid." Lyra watched carefully, her posture composed but attentive. "You believe the interference will mask my biological signature?" Daniel nodded while connecting a short power cable between two of the coils. "That is the theory." The cable snapped into place with a soft click and the coils responded immediately, their glow brightening as energy flowed through the improvised circuit. The air in the cargo bay gained a faint electric scent, similar to the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. Daniel stepped back and studied his work like an artist evaluating a painting. "Not perfect," he muttered, "but it should make the scanners see a noisy power field instead of a person." Above them, another deep vibration rolled through the station as the fleet continued maneuvering in orbit. This time, the sound was accompanied by a low mechanical tone from the station speakers. External scan grid initializing. Daniel checked the terminal again. The countdown timer now showed less than 2 minutes. "Time is running out," Lyra said quietly. Daniel glanced at the screen and nodded. "Yeah, I noticed." He pointed toward the open crate surrounded by the glowing stabilizers. "Step inside." Lyra hesitated for a fraction of a second before moving toward the crate. Daniel noticed the hesitation but did not comment on it. Trust was rarely comfortable, especially when it involved climbing into a box filled with humming machinery inside a mechanic's repair bay. She stepped into the crate carefully, her silver hair catching the pale light as she lowered herself between the stabilizer coils. Daniel adjusted one of the power units slightly to widen the interference field around her position. The faint energy glow surrounded her like a quiet halo of blue light. For a moment the two of them simply looked at each other across the edge of the crate. Daniel gave a small, reassuring shrug. "Not the royal accommodations you are used to, I imagine." Lyra's calm expression returned, though this time there was a trace of quiet humor in her eyes. "I suspect palace engineers would not approve of this solution." Daniel grinned. "That is because palace engineers do not fix things with scrap parts and optimism." The station speakers crackled again as the scan grid reached full power. A faint vibration passed through the air itself now, almost like a distant wind moving through invisible currents. Daniel recognized the feeling immediately. Active scanning waves. The sensors from the fleet above were now sweeping across the station layer by layer. He reached down and pulled the crate lid halfway closed, leaving a narrow gap for airflow. The glow from the stabilizer coils flickered through the small opening. "All right," he said quietly. "Now we see if my repair skills are good enough to fool a royal fleet." Lyra's golden eyes met his one last time through the narrow opening before the lid settled into place. Daniel turned toward the terminal display as the scan waves began passing through the station structure. The screen filled with flickering data patterns as external sensors probed every corridor and cargo hold. He folded his arms and watched the readings carefully, listening to the low hum of machinery around him, and hoping that sometimes the most ordinary mechanic in the galaxy could still outsmart the most powerful technology above it. The first scan wave passed through the station like an invisible tide. Daniel Carter felt it before he saw it on the terminal. The faint pressure in the air shifted slightly, almost like the moment when a subway train moves through a tunnel 2 floors below you. The stabilizer coils inside the crate hummed a little louder as their improvised interference field reacted to the scanning energy sweeping through the cargo bay. Daniel watched the screen carefully while lines of diagnostic data rolled across the display. Environmental radiation noise, stable. Structural mapping, stable. Organic signature sweep, pending. He folded his arms and leaned against the console, trying to look like a man who had absolutely nothing unusual happening inside his repair bay at 2 in the morning. Outside the cargo bay corridor, the station remained quiet, but the silence now felt different. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone is waiting for something. The scanner wave intensified for a moment, and the terminal screen flickered with fresh readings as the external sensors adjusted their focus. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Look at the glowing junk pile and move along." The stabilizer coils responded with another soft pulse of light from inside the crate. For a brief moment, the interference pattern spiked across the display, creating a messy cloud of static on the environmental grid. Daniel smiled faintly. That is what I like to see. Another scan layer passed through the station structure. This time the system checked deeper biological signatures. The terminal showed a brief alert as the sensors attempted to isolate life signs within the cargo bay. Daniel watched the screen carefully while the detection algorithm struggled against the radiation noise created by the coils. The reading flickered once, twice, then blurred into a distorted cluster of energy signatures that looked more like broken machinery than a living being. The scan moved on. Daniel released a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "All right," he whispered quietly. "Round 1 goes to the mechanic." The stabilizer coils slowly returned to their normal hum as the first scan sweep continued deeper into the station's internal sectors. The cargo bay lights flickered once, then steadied again. On the terminal display, the external scan grid shifted toward another dock ring several hundred feet away. Daniel straightened and stretched his shoulders. "Not done yet," he murmured. But that was promising. Inside the crate, Lyra Vale remained completely silent. Through the narrow ventilation gap, the faint blue glow of the coils illuminated her calm expression. She could feel the scanning waves passing through the station structure like distant ripples in still water. For several seconds, she listened to the hum of Daniel's improvised interference field and the quiet rhythm of machinery around her. Finally, Daniel stepped closer to the crate and lifted the lid slightly, just enough to see her face between the stabilizer units. "Good news," he said softly. "Your royal fan club did not notice you on the first sweep." Lyra looked up at him, her golden eyes steady. "Your strategy is effective." Daniel shrugged with a small grin. "Do not sound too impressed yet. They will run multiple passes. Fleets like that do not trust the first scan." As if confirming his words, the station speakers crackled again overhead. External scan grid recalibrating for secondary sweep. Daniel slowly closed the crate lid again and sighed. "See," he said quietly. "Round 2 is about to start." He returned to the terminal while the second wave of scanning energy began building above the station. This time the vibration felt slightly stronger, the sensors searching with greater precision. Daniel rested his hands on the console and stared at the scrolling data patterns with the calm patience of a mechanic who had already committed to finishing the repair no matter how complicated the job became. The second scan wave felt sharper than the first. Daniel Carter noticed it immediately in the way the stabilizer coils reacted. Their steady hum rose half a tone higher, like an engine pushed just a little closer to its limit. The terminal display flickered as new diagnostic lines began pouring across the screen. Secondary biological sweep initializing. Daniel leaned closer to the console, his eyes moving quickly across the data. "They are tightening the net," he murmured. Outside the cargo bay, the station corridors remained quiet, but the silence had changed again. Now it carried the distant echo of activity from other dock rings where security teams were probably checking manifests and running internal diagnostics. Daniel knew how this worked. The fleet scanned from above while the station authorities verified from within. Between the two systems, there were very few places left to hide. The second wave passed through the station structure with a faint ripple that Daniel could feel through the soles of his boots. The stabilizer coils responded with a stronger glow inside the crate, their interference field widening automatically as the scanning energy intensified. On the terminal screen, the environmental map of the cargo bay appeared as a three-dimensional grid filled with shifting light. The system tried to isolate energy signatures within the interference field, but the radiation noise from the coils blurred everything together into a chaotic storm of signals. Daniel watched the pattern carefully. The sensors attempted to focus once, then again, each time adjusting their algorithm to filter the noise. For a moment, the detection program highlighted a cluster near the crate. Daniel held his breath. The stabilizers pulsed again, releasing another wave of harmless radiation static that distorted the reading just enough to confuse the scanning algorithm. The highlighted cluster flickered uncertainly, then dissolved back into the surrounding noise. Daniel allowed himself a small grin. "Still messy enough?" he whispered. Inside the crate, Lyra remained perfectly still between the humming coils. The faint blue light reflected across the inside walls of the container while the stabilizers vibrated softly around her. She could feel the scanning energy passing through the station again, probing deeper this time, more precise and methodical. Despite the tension of the moment, she noticed something unusual about the human mechanic working outside the crate. Daniel did not behave like someone facing the attention of a royal fleet. He was focused, patient, almost relaxed in the middle of the crisis, as though solving impossible problems with improvised tools was simply another part of his normal routine. Outside the crate, Daniel tapped the terminal once more, watching the sensor grid as the scan continued to sweep across the station. Dock rings a through D cleared. The cargo bay remained hidden inside the interference field without drawing further attention. Finally, the scanning wave began shifting toward the central sectors of the station. Daniel exhaled slowly and leaned back against the console. "All right," he said quietly to himself. Second round complete. He stepped toward the crate and lifted the lid slightly again. The stabilizer coils glowed steadily around Lyra, their interference field now stable enough to mask her completely. Daniel gave her a quick nod. "Your fleet friends are persistent," he said softly. "But right now they are chasing ghosts in the wrong part of the station." Lyra studied his face in the dim blue light. "You anticipated their methods." Daniel shrugged lightly. Mechanics learn a lot about systems by watching how they fail. He closed the crate lid again just as the station speakers crackled once more overhead. External Fleet Command requesting internal security verification of all cargo sectors. Daniel slowly looked up toward the ceiling speaker and let out a quiet sigh. "Well," he muttered, "it seems the fleet has decided to ask the station to double-check their work." He glanced toward the cargo bay door at the end of the corridor. "And that part," he added calmly, "is going to happen a lot closer to us." Daniel Carter looked toward the cargo bay door and listened carefully. The station corridor beyond it had been quiet all night, but now faint sounds echoed through the metal walls. Footsteps. Slow, methodical, and getting closer. He did not need a terminal display to know what that meant. Internal security had started their inspection sweep. He exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck. "Well," he murmured to himself, "that part arrived faster than I hoped." The stabilizer coils inside the crate continued their steady hum, casting a soft blue glow that pulsed gently against the cargo bay walls. Daniel glanced down at the crate for a moment before walking back to the terminal. The interference field remained stable, the radiation noise thick enough to distort any external scan. But a physical inspection was different. Human eyes and handheld sensors did not always follow the same rules as orbital scanners. The corridor footsteps grew louder. 2 people at least. Maybe 3. Daniel moved quickly now, not with panic, but with the focused efficiency of someone who had solved mechanical disasters before sunrise more times than he could count. He grabbed the oily rag from the workbench and wiped his hands again, then tossed a wrench onto the open engine housing of the half-repaired shuttle in the middle of the bay. The metal clanged loudly enough to echo down the corridor. A few seconds later, the cargo bay door slid open with a smooth mechanical hiss. 2 station security officers stepped inside, wearing gray inspection uniforms and carrying compact scanning tablets. Their boots thudded softly against the deck as they entered the bay. One of them looked around at the stacks of equipment and the partially disassembled shuttle engine. "Dock inspection," the taller officer announced calmly. Daniel turned around with the expression of a tired mechanic who had been interrupted in the middle of a long shift. "Yeah, I figured," he said, wiping grease from his fingers. "Fleet above us probably wants everything checked twice." The second officer nodded. "Standard verification request from external command. We need to run a quick scan of all cargo compartments." Daniel shrugged and stepped aside from the terminal. "Be my guest. Just do not lean on that engine housing. The cooling manifold is still loose." The officers began moving through the cargo bay, their handheld scanners humming quietly as they passed the devices over crates and equipment. The scanning beams cast faint green lines across the metal surfaces while the devices collected environmental data. Daniel leaned casually against the workbench, watching them the same way he might watch customers browsing spare parts in a repair shop. Inside the crate, Lyra Vale remained motionless between the stabilizer coils. The faint vibration of the handheld scanners passed through the metal container walls as the officers moved closer. The interference field from the coils continued to distort the surrounding energy patterns, but a handheld scan at close range could still notice unusual readings. One of the officers paused near the crate and glanced at the flickering blue glow leaking through the ventilation seam. "What is in this container?" he asked. Daniel did not miss a beat. "Old fusion stabilizers," he replied casually. half-burned-out salvage parts. They leak radiation like a broken flashlight leaks batteries. The officer lifted his scanner and ran a quick sweep across the crate's surface. The device beeped once, displaying a messy cluster of energy readings. The officer frowned slightly at the chaotic data. These readings are unstable. Daniel nodded as if the comment was completely expected. That is why they are sitting in a scrap crate instead of a starship. The officer studied the display again for a moment before lowering the scanner. Radiation interference detected, he said to his partner. Probably salvage residue. The second officer nodded and continued scanning the rest of the bay. Daniel remained leaning against the workbench, arms crossed. His expression relaxed even though his heartbeat had quietly doubled in speed. A few seconds later the officers finished their sweep and turned back toward the door. Cargo bay verified, the taller officer said. No irregular life signs detected. Daniel gave them a small nod as they walked out. Good luck finding whatever the fleet lost, he called after them. The cargo bay door slid closed again with a soft metallic click. The corridor fell silent once more. Daniel waited 3 long seconds before pushing himself away from the workbench and walking quickly toward the crate. He lifted the lid slightly and looked inside at the calm golden eyes glowing in the stabilizer light. Then he let out a quiet breath and gave a crooked smile. Well, Princess, he whispered softly, it seems your fleet is having a very difficult night. Daniel Carter kept the crate lid open only a few inches while the stabilizer coils continued humming softly around Princess Lyra. The faint blue glow painted shifting reflections across the cargo bay ceiling, turning the ordinary repair shop into something that almost looked otherworldly. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence after danger had passed always felt heavier than the danger itself. Daniel finally leaned his forearms on the edge of the crate and let out a slow breath. Well, he said quietly, that was closer than I prefer before breakfast. Lyra studied him from inside the crate, her golden eyes steady in the soft interference light. You remained calm while they were here, she said. Daniel shrugged lightly. When you spend enough time fixing engines that can explode if you tighten the wrong bolt, you learn to stay calm during inspections. He reached down and powered off one of the stabilizer coils. The glow dimmed slightly as the interference field relaxed. The faint electric scent in the air faded with it. All right, he continued, lifting another coil aside so she could move more comfortably. You can come out now. Your welcoming committee just finished their tour. Lyra stepped carefully out of the crate, unfolding to her full height as the remaining stabilizers powered down around her. For the first time since arriving in the cargo bay, she looked around the room more slowly, taking in the scattered tools, the unfinished shuttle engine, and the quiet practicality of Daniel's workspace. The station above them still vibrated faintly from the massive fleet hovering in orbit. Your solution prevented their scanners from locating me, she said. Daniel gave a small half-smile. I told you. Scrap parts and optimism. He moved back toward the terminal and checked the orbital display again. The 4 fleet vessels still hovered above the station like silent mountains of steel. Their scan grid continued to sweep the surrounding sectors, though the cargo bays were now marked as verified. Daniel leaned back against the console and folded his arms while studying the icons. They are not leaving, he said thoughtfully. Lyra walked over beside him and followed his gaze to the screen. No, she replied quietly. They will remain until they confirm my location. Daniel glanced sideways at her. Which means they are going to keep searching until they get tired of guessing. He tapped the screen and zoomed the display outward, revealing nearby shipping lanes and the outer docking rings of the station. The problem is that sooner or later they will start asking more detailed questions. Lyra turned toward him slightly. You are referring to the station administration. Daniel nodded. Fleet Command might not know where you are, but someone up there will eventually ask the station director to check crew lists, docking records, and surveillance feeds. He gestured around the cargo bay. And eventually that search will reach the mechanic who works alone at 3 in the morning. Lyra remained silent for a moment, considering the implications. Daniel noticed that same calm focus returning to her expression. Finally she spoke. You could still report me. Daniel looked at her as if the idea had only just occurred to him. Then he laughed softly and shook his head. Lady, if I was planning to do that, I would have called security the moment you stepped out from behind that crate. He picked up the oily rag again and wiped his hands out of habit. Besides, he added casually, my night has already become interesting. It would be a shame to stop now. Lyra studied him carefully, as if trying to understand how someone with so little power could treat a situation involving a royal fleet with such relaxed humor. You are helping me, she said slowly. Daniel tossed the rag onto the workbench again and gave her a crooked grin. At the moment, I am helping myself avoid paperwork. Then he nodded toward the ceiling where the distant presence of the fleet still rumbled faintly through the station hall. But if we are being honest, Princess, I suspect your story is about to become a lot more complicated before this night is over. Daniel Carter stared at the orbital display for another long moment while the soft vibration of the fleet continued to echo through the station hall. The icons representing the 4 massive ships had not moved. They floated above the station like silent judges waiting for someone to make a mistake. Daniel finally pushed himself away from the console and walked slowly across the cargo bay, his boots echoing lightly against the metal floor. All right, he said thoughtfully, almost to himself. Let us assume those ships are not leaving anytime soon. Lyra stood near the crate where the stabilizer coils had been humming only minutes before. Without the interference field, the cargo bay felt quieter, almost ordinary again, though the distant presence of the fleet above reminded them that the night was far from normal. They will continue searching until they confirm my location, Lyra said calmly. Daniel nodded once. That part one understand. He picked up a small handheld scanner from the workbench and turned it over in his hands, not because he needed it, but because mechanics often thought better when they had something to hold. What I do not understand is why a royal fleet is searching for its own princess like she is a missing shipment. Lyra did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the ceiling, listening to the faint mechanical rumble of the ships above the station. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet weight that had not been there before. Because they are not searching to bring me home. Daniel raised an eyebrow and leaned against the workbench again. That is the second time you have hinted at that. He studied her expression carefully. You want to explain it? Lyra turned back toward him, her golden eyes reflecting the dim cargo bay lights. My presence on this station is not an accident. Daniel tilted his head slightly. I figured that part out already. She continued calmly. There are factions within the Empire that believe the High Throne should change hands. Daniel let out a slow breath. Political trouble, he said quietly. Every civilization eventually invents that. Lyra nodded once. Certain members of the fleet believe removing me from the succession would simplify the situation. Daniel stared at her for a moment before letting out a low whistle. So those ships up there are not rescue ships. Lyra met his gaze without hesitation. No, Daniel rubbed the back of his neck again, absorbing the idea. Well, he muttered, that definitely explains the thorough search. He walked back to the terminal and glanced again at the fleet icons on the screen. For a few seconds the cargo bay fell silent except for the quiet hum of cooling machinery and the distant vibration of engines above the station. Finally Daniel looked back at her. All right, Princess. Let me make sure I understand this situation correctly. He gestured toward the ceiling. A royal fleet is hovering above this station. Then he gestured toward her. And at least part of that fleet would prefer if the princess they are looking for never returned home. Lyra nodded once. Daniel gave a small, crooked smile that carried more curiosity than fear. You know, he said, I was expecting my night shift to involve a broken coolant pump and maybe a cup of terrible station coffee. He looked up toward the ceiling again. Instead, I am apparently standing in the middle of an imperial succession problem. Lyra studied him carefully. You still have the option to remove yourself from this situation. Daniel considered that statement for about 2 seconds before shaking his head lightly. That would have been easier before I helped hide you from half the fleet. He leaned casually against the console and folded his arms again. Besides, he added with a faint grin, now I am curious how this story ends. Daniel Carter remained leaning against the console for several seconds after Lyra finished explaining the situation. The quiet hum of the cargo bay seemed louder now that the truth had settled into the room. Outside the station hull, the fleet continued its silent watch, engines vibrating faintly through layers of metal and insulation. Daniel finally looked back at the orbital display and shook his head slowly. You know, he said, I once thought my worst night involved a broken reactor coolant valve and a storm knocking out half the station power grid. He pointed up toward the ceiling where the distant ships hovered beyond the hull. Turns out that was just practice. Lyra watched him carefully. She had expected many reactions when someone discovered the truth about her situation. Fear, anger, perhaps even a desperate attempt to bargain for safety. What she had not expected was calm curiosity. Daniel tapped the display again, zooming out further to show the surrounding sector of space. Several civilian shipping routes curved around the station like glowing threads. Most of the traffic had already diverted to avoid the fleet presence. "Those ships are not here for a quick visit," he said thoughtfully. "They are locking down the area." Lyra nodded. "They will maintain a perimeter until they locate me." Daniel studied the traffic patterns for a moment before glancing back at her. "Which means staying here forever is not an option." Lyra understood immediately. "Eventually the search will become more aggressive." Daniel pointed at the screen again. "Right now they are scanning and asking polite questions." He gave a small crooked smile. "Sooner or later someone on those ships will decide that polite questions are not working." The cargo bay fell quiet again for a moment. Daniel walked across the room toward the unfinished shuttle engine and rested one hand on the metal frame. His eyes moved slowly across the components as if studying the machine, though his mind was clearly somewhere else. Mechanics often solve complicated problems by imagining the system from every possible angle. After a few seconds he spoke again. "Tell me something, Princess." Lyra stepped closer, watching him with quiet interest. "What is it?" Daniel tapped the side of the shuttle hull with his knuckles. The metal echoed softly through the cargo bay. "If you had a ship that could slip past a search grid without attracting attention, where would you go?" Lyra looked toward the terminal display again, where the fleet icons hovered above the station. "Somewhere outside the Imperial patrol sectors." Daniel nodded slowly. "Exactly." He walked back to the console and began typing commands into the terminal. The screen changed from the orbital traffic map to a list of docked vessels and repair schedules. Lyra watched the scrolling data carefully. "You are looking for a ship." Daniel smiled faintly. "Not just any ship." He pointed to one entry halfway down the list. "That one." The screen displayed a small independent transport vessel scheduled for engine maintenance in Dockring C. Its registration showed civilian salvage credentials and a departure window within the next 2 hours. Lyra studied the data. "A cargo transport." Daniel nodded. "A very boring cargo transport." He leaned back in the chair and folded his arms again. "Which is exactly the kind of ship that fleets tend to ignore." Lyra's golden eyes narrowed slightly with interest. "You intend to help me leave the station?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "I told you earlier that my night had already become interesting." He glanced once more at the distant fleet icons glowing on the screen. "If those ships are waiting for you to make a mistake, then the smartest move is to leave before they realize the game has changed." He looked back at her and gave the same crooked mechanics grin she had already begun to recognize. "Besides," he added quietly, "I have always wanted to see if a simple repair dock mechanic could outthink an imperial fleet." Daniel Carter studied the transport listing on the terminal for several more seconds, while the quiet vibration of the fleet continued to echo through the station. The small civilian vessel he had selected looked insignificant compared to the massive warships orbiting above, but that was exactly why it mattered. In space, the largest ships drew attention. The smallest ones slipped between the cracks. He finally pushed himself up from the chair and turned toward Lyra. "All right," he said calmly. "Here is the situation." He pointed to the display where the transport's departure window blinked softly. "That cargo ship leaves Dockring C in 1 hour and 42 minutes. Officially, it is carrying mechanical salvage and spare reactor parts to a recycling yard about 300 million miles from here." Lyra studied the screen carefully. "And you intend for me to be on that ship?" Daniel nodded. "Exactly." He walked across the cargo bay toward the half-repaired shuttle engine again, picking up a small wrench and spinning it idly in his fingers while he thought. "Ships like that move in and out of stations all the time," he continued. "Nobody gives them a second look because they are boring." He glanced up toward the ceiling as another faint rumble from the fleet rolled through the hull. "And right now the fleet is looking for something dramatic. Royal transports, military escorts, hidden cruisers." He gave a small grin. "Not a rusty cargo hauler with a mechanic's repair tag." Lyra walked closer, her expression thoughtful as she considered the plan. "You would accompany the ship." Daniel shrugged lightly. "Someone has to sign the repair clearance." He tapped the side of the engine housing beside him. "According to the station registry, that transport is still waiting on final engine diagnostics from Dockring C." Lyra understood the implication immediately. You will approve the repair. Daniel nodded once. Which means I walk the captain through the inspection report, file the clearance, and watch the ship leave. He paused for a moment, then added with a faint smile, with one additional passenger hidden somewhere between the cargo containers. Lyra looked toward the orbital display again, where the fleet icons still hovered above the station like silent shadows. They will still be scanning ships that depart. Daniel walked back to the console and pulled up the station traffic lane overlay. Several outbound routes curved away from the station like glowing threads in the dark. True, he said, but scans work best when you know exactly what you are searching for. He zoomed the display farther out until the cargo ship's route extended beyond the fleet perimeter. Right now they are searching for a princess traveling like a princess. He looked back at her with the same relaxed confidence he had shown all night. Nobody expects a royal heir to leave inside a cargo shipment of broken engine parts. Lyra watched him quietly, measuring the strange human who seemed far more comfortable challenging a fleet than most commanders she had known. You are risking a great deal, she said softly. Daniel leaned against the console again and folded his arms. Maybe. Then he looked up toward the ceiling one last time as the distant rumble of the fleet continued to shake the station ever so slightly. After a moment he looked back at her and gave a small crooked smile. But I told you earlier I was curious how this story ends. He nodded toward the terminal where the countdown timer for the cargo transport's departure continued ticking steadily downward. And right now, he added quietly, the next chapter leaves this station in about 1 hour.